Welcome to Revealing Digital Show, the show that aims to make the bridge between science and consciousness. You heard me several times saying that we are mainly vacuum. And if we zoom out, we are also mainly water. Today, on my show, I have the honor to have as a guest Professor Gerald Pollack. He's an amazing scientist, and his research on water is a revolution. Let's discover it together. So thank you, Professor Gerald Pollack, which your nickname is Jerry. I saw it in different interview and conference.
Jerry is fine.
Yeah. Jerry is fine? Okay. I'm so honored to have you today and to discuss with you your research. And the first thing I learned is that we really don't know what we think we know about water. Mainly, people think that water, and as an engineer, I learned that water is liquid, vapor, or solid. And I learned from you that there is a fourth phase. Could you tell us more about it?
Sure, I'm delighted to. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you. And yeah, the fourth phase has occupied my life and the life of people working in my laboratory now for almost a couple of decades. We all learned, as you suggest, we all learned that water has three phases, but we discovered a different phase, and this phase is not just merely a laboratory curiosity, but in fact it's a phase that fills our bodies. So you know, it has considerable implication for our health and the way we live, and it's also throughout nature. And maybe the best way to illustrate is to show a few slides, if I may.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me share the screen. It all starts with this guy, Gilbert Ling, who passed several years ago, and he. Among other people, including the famous Nobel laureate Albert Szent-Györgyi, the father of modern biochemistry, those two people were really influential in my own thinking and led to the concept that I'm going to be talking about the fourth phase of water. So Gilbert Ling, first of all, let me tell you about his background. In 1948, China sent 3 scholars to the US. They were chosen from throughout all of China, hand-selected to come to the US. One was a chemist, one was a physicist, and Gilbert was the biologist. And of the 3, 2 of them went on to win Nobel Prizes in chemistry and in physics. And Gilbert Ling, in my view, should have won at least 2 Nobel Prizes for what he accomplished. And his main theme was that in biology, inside of cells, the water is not liquid water. And you may think that this is preposterous, but when I heard his arguments, I didn't think they were preposterous at all. In fact, when you think about it, you can prove to yourself very quickly that the water inside the cell is not liquid water, as the textbooks assert. All you need to do is cut yourself. And, you know, if the water inside your cells were liquid water, the water would come pouring out like from a broken pipe, but that doesn't happen. So there's something that's different about the water. And Gilbert Ling asserted that the water molecules inside the cell were lined up like soldiers at attention. They were, he called it structured water. And that view is also espoused by Albert Szent-Györgyi, whom I mentioned, the father of modern biochemistry. I met Gilbert at a conference in Hungary, and wow, was I impressed, not only by his presentation, but also by the presentations of a half dozen or even maybe closer to a dozen scientists who had evidence to support his point of view. And his point of view made sense to me because if you think of water as a dipole, that is like a bean with a plus at one end and a minus at the other end, you could imagine that these beans would stack upon one another, with the negative of one associated with the positive of its neighbor. And Gilbert asserted that this stacking can occur over rather long distances. And so with his assertion, or his theory, you might say, and supporting evidence, I was astonished. And I went back to back home in Seattle, and I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm naive, and maybe this idea makes no sense at all. So I gave one of his books he had written 5 books by then, I think, mainly on this subject. And I gave it to some of my students and postdocs, and every single one of them came back to me and said, this guy seems like he's on target, and if he's right, everything is wrong. Everything we know about biology is wrong. And of course, you can't help but be stimulated by comments like that. And, and the first thing I did was I decided to write a book. Why write a book? Well, Gilbert Ling's writings are really difficult.
Yes.
You found the same, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. So Gilbert,
this book.
Yeah.
Which explain more clearly.
Thank you. So this was my first book on the subject, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, and it was basically designed. At least the first half of the book was designed to explain Gilbert Ling's ideas in ways that are understandable. And I'm not sure if I succeeded, but I certainly tried. The second half was designed to go one step beyond. And Gilbert was not so happy with my going one step beyond, because it seemed that I was overshadowing what Gilbert had been doing for his entire life. And I understood that feeling. Eventually, we reconciled and sustained our friendship, but it was a bit difficult at the time. So what I went on to show in the second half of the book is that these organized, structured water molecules participated absolutely centrally in everything that the cell does. Many different kinds of cells, maybe all cells, but obviously, I haven't addressed what happens in all cells. That's impossible. And so the idea put forth with lots of evidence was very simple, that when the cell is in its, shall we say, unactivated state, all the molecules were structured, lined up, organized, as Gilbert was suggesting. But when the cell was activated, what happens is that these water molecules undergo a transition, a so-called phase transition, going from the structured state to ordinary liquid water, and then back again after the cell's activity was finished. So for a muscle cell, for example, when the muscle is in the relaxed state, all the water molecules are lined up, as Gilbert Ling suggested. And then when the muscle is activated to contract, it's not only the proteins that undergo a transition, but also the water. The two of them together, coupled, create the so-called phase transition. And then when the muscle relaxes again, everything returns to the initial condition. And so this was the major point in the book. And the book received mixed reviews. Some said, oh, this is nothing more than Gilbert Ling. And if you believe Gilbert Ling's nonsense, then you can believe this. Otherwise, forget it. And at the other end of the spectrum was a well-known scientist from Harvard University. And of course, if it's from Harvard, you have to believe it. He said, this is a 305-page preface to the future of cell biology. I like that one better. At any rate, so it was it was Gilbert Ling largely who got me started. And, you know, eventually we found something I'll explain in a few moments, different, a bit different from what Gilbert said. In some ways, fundamentally different, but maintaining the idea of water structure. This is the essence. And so we started our experiments taking into account Gilbert Ling's ideas, which are shown on in the next slide. The next slide shows a protein, and the surface of the protein is so-called hydrophilic, water-loving, with charges all along the surface. And the water molecules are shown as these dipoles. And it's easy to imagine the first layer of dipoles sticking to the surface because these dipoles have a plus and minus. So you can imagine the plus of a water molecule sticking to the minus sitting on the surface. And Gilbert maintained something different from what physical chemists maintain. And the physical chemists suggest that, yeah, sure, you can have one or two molecular layers that are ordered in the way I just described. But Gilbert said, no, it extends way beyond that. It's not just one or two molecular layers, but numerous, hundreds, if not thousands. And I can explain later why it's in certain cases well beyond 1,000. So anyway, this is how we got started, and doing experiments to see what was really going on, and we took into account that these ordered layers I'm showing here of water. It's like a crystal, you know. In crystals, the molecules are ordered; they're lined up. And so Gilbert was implying that the water molecules created something like a liquid crystal, and crystals tend to be pure, and because they're pure, it means that any contaminants, if you will, or molecules of any sort or particles will be excluded from the water. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pure. You see, so we were trying to figure out to look for an experimental setup where we could see that particles were excluded from some region. And, you know, we were shooting in the dark, so to speak, because we didn't know if we could find such a system. But I guess through good fortune, we found it. And next slide is shows the experimental setup, the first one that we looked at. In fact, this is one of the first observations recorded on video. So at the left side, you can see a gel. And this gel is a polyvinyl alcohol gel sitting in a chamber. The chamber is basically the entire field that you see. And I'm pointing right now to the boundary between the edge of the gel and the water. And in the water, we put particles. And these particles were little spheres called microspheres, widely used throughout all of science. And we looked in the microscope, and voila, there it was. We could see between a zone that started at the edge of the gel and went for some distance out where there were no particles, no microspheres. And we said to ourselves, my goodness, it's possible that next to the gel are these ordered water molecules, which I think you can't see the scale here, but it's about 10 micrometers, which is you know, a pretty substantial distance. And we thought maybe this was not evidence, but it was suggestive that, you know, maybe in this region all the water molecules were lined up, and this would be quite a few water molecules. And we watched the video, and I'm showing the video now, and you can see that this zone kept growing and growing and growing. And it grew to about roughly 50 micrometers, about half the thickness of a human hair. And then it stopped. And I apologize for there is a scale there, but you can barely see it. So someone suggested that we give this a name. And the water in here, eventually we called fourth phase water because it was so different from ordinary water, and also parenthetically, different from what Gilbert Ling suggested, but nonetheless ordered. And someone suggested, well, since it excludes particles, why don't you call it exclusion zone?
Zone.
And so
Easy.
we called it exclusion zone. And the water in here, we called exclusion zone water or EZ water. It's easy to remember.
Yeah, I like this.
Yeah, I liked it too. I thought, and so yeah, we called it. But I know in Europe,
yeah, it's not working in Europe. Zone
it doesn't work. It's
d'exclusion
EZ.
is, yeah, it's ZE.
Z, yeah.
But that's okay.
Yeah, but anyway, we called it. It was actually a mistake, maybe, to call it that. Easy to remember, but it's not the main point. The main point is not the exclusion, but the main point is the other features of this kind of ordered water, which I'll explain in a moment, which have huge implication for all of nature. And so that's why we eventually called it fourth phase water instead of EZ water. So how does this work? Well, the next slide is diagrammatic. So on the left side, you see what in the previous slide was a gel, but it doesn't need to be a gel. It could be virtually any surface that's hydrophilic, and that's shown in gray here. And at the boundary on the right side that I'm pointing to right now starts with water. And what happens is that the water undergoes a transformation. The first layer of molecules that are adjacent to the surface of this hydrophilic material undergo a transformation into the special EZ or fourth phase structure. And that serves as the nucleation site for the growth of the second layer and the third, and the layers keep on growing. Now, what we found experimentally was that this is not just water, as Gilbert Ling had suggested, not just water molecules, because we stuck electrodes in here. The electrodes were these very sharp tipped electrodes invented by none other than the same Gilbert Ling. And we found that this zone was negatively charged. So, we had to come to the quick realization that it couldn't be simply water molecules, because water molecules are neutral. And you could stack water molecules, from Seattle to Frankfurt, and you'd never get a negative charge. But we found a negative charge. And so experimentally, we had to realize or come to the conclusion that it couldn't simply be a stack of water molecules. It had to be something different. And I'll show in the next slide what we found that it actually is. But there's another point here that I want to emphasize on this slide, and that is that all of this starts from water molecules, and water molecules are neutral. So if this region is negatively charged, the positive charges had to go somewhere, and we found that they're here floating as protons or hydronium ions in the water. So you've got negative here and positive here, and that basically constitutes a battery. You've got separated minus and plus. And we found indeed that we could stick an electrode in the negative region, an electrode in the positive region, and obtain current flow enough to light an LED. So you get the separation of charge, and this is potential energy. And this potential energy, if all of this operates inside your body, insides of cells, this potential energy is capable of delivering energy to the cell. And so the way, just in slightly more detail, the way this happens, we found, is that, again, all of this begins with water molecules. And on the lower left, you can see what the water molecule looks like. It's got an oxygen with valence of -2 and 2 hydrogens. And what happens is that some energy comes around. I'll explain what that energy is in a moment. And what happens is it breaks the water molecule, as shown here by this dashed line. And so one part of it is negatively charged, 2 minuses, 1 plus, and the other part is positively charged. And it turns out that this negatively charged component, these components then are responsible for the buildup of this fourth phase, and the positive parts here get kicked out into the water, and so therefore you get negative on the left side, positive on the right side, and that's the battery that we're talking about. So one more slide, or maybe I put aside two of them. I can't recall. In detail, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a hydrophilic material initially sitting next to water, and out of the water comes a transformation, not into those dipoles, as Gilbert Ling suggested, but into what can best be described as honeycomb sheets. And the hexagons that are included are very common in nature, and these hexagons appear in the water. So you get the first layer then nucleates the growth of the second layer and the third, and so on, and they keep growing, as the slide shows. And if you look at the surface of any of those layers, as I mentioned, it's hexagonal. So you've got oxygens sitting at the vertices and hydrogens in between. And if you count the numbers of negatives and positives, or hydrogens and oxygens in the unit cell, if you count it, it turns out it's not H2O. And it can't be H2O because H2O is neutral. Experiments show that this is negatively charged. So it turns out if you do the count, it's H3O2. So the EZ is in fact H3O2 is what we've been able to discern. Okay, and I think I'll stop here because I know you have a lot of questions, and I will disable the slides.
I think we thanks to your explanation, we better understand now the fourth phase of water and how it looks like and where the research starts and how you came to it. And now I would like to move to you discovered that there is 4 foundational principles. You said that discovering easy it's a revolution in biology, and it's bring with this research a lot of impact. And there is 4 foundational principles. Water has 4 phases. Water stores energy. Water gets energy from light, and like charged entities can attract one another. What's the impact of these 4 foundational principles in our life, concretely?
Okay, the impact in our life. Okay. I'm not sure the best way to answer this, but let me deviate one bit, and please, if I deviate too much, bring me back to that.
Okay, don't worry.
So the light issue I need to address first because I didn't talk about it.
Yes.
So I did mention in those slides that what you're creating is like a battery with separated plus and minus. But in order for your cell phone to work, by the way, I have no cell phone. I think I'm the last person on the earth.
Wow, congrats.
I'm not sure. But anyway, you know that your cell phone won't work unless you plug it in at night and have it charged. And all batteries need to be charged in one way or another. Otherwise, they won't be able to supply any energy. They need to be recharged. And so where does the charge come from? Where does the energy come from to build this separation of charge? And this is really fundamental. And it comes from, we found it comes from light. And this was actually observed first by a student in the lab who was doing what he wasn't supposed to do. He was sitting with one of these chambers that I showed on the lab bench, and he was bored, I guess, maybe, and he saw sitting next to him was a gooseneck lamp. So he took the lamp and he shined it on the chamber, and where he shined it, the exclusion zone, the region without the microspheres, the region grew like crazy. And then he called me in. He said, "Hey, take a look at this." And I looked, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He had the answer, that we were scratching our heads collectively to try to figure out, where does the energy come from? We couldn't figure it out. So I said, well, take the lamp away. And this region that had grown, the EZ region that had grown in size, then began to diminish. And after some tens of minutes, it went back to the original. So it was reversible. And then we got into gear, and we tried to find out, well, light has a broad spectrum of wavelengths, and which wavelengths were important. And we tested a range of wavelengths ranging at the short wavelength end, from ultraviolet through the visible range, and into the spectral range that included infrared, the long wavelengths. And we found ultraviolet did nothing, at least nothing to the size. And visible light mostly did nothing, except when we began to get to the reds, then it began to have a little bit of effect. And we got to the longer wavelengths that we can't see in the infrared, especially around 3 micrometers, a little bit beyond the edge of visible. It was spectacularly effective in building EZ. We could actually, with LEDs, of very weak LEDs, we could grow it to 10 times the original size. Wow. It's amazing. And then you take it away, and it returns back to the original.
So does it mean that we have to expose ourselves to infrared?
Well, you don't have to, because it's all over the place. It requires no. So we often equate infrared with heat. It's not exactly correct, but it's close enough. So inside our body, the metabolic energy is expressed as heat. We maintain body temperature because the core of our body is generating heat. So you've got infrared coming from inside, but even more from outside. It's not just the sun, half of which is infrared. Half of the energy is infrared, but everything around you. So if you were to turn off the lights in the room in which you're sitting, so that everything is black and you couldn't see anything, and your faithful cell phone camera could record nothing. If you had an infrared camera, that is an ordinary camera with an infrared sensor instead of a visible light sensor, you get a beautiful image of the microphone, of your face, the wall, and the window, everything, which means that everything is generating infrared energy. Otherwise, you wouldn't get an image. So it's all around you, coming from inside and outside, and there's plenty of it. So there's no need to, quote, subject yourself to any special kind of energy. It's always there, which means that EZ is always there. If you add more energy, you get bigger EZ. So it's as simple as that. So now, returning to the question that you asked, why is this important in our lives? Well, the answer, by the way, I've done a whole bunch of interviews. Nobody ever asked me that question. So it's a great question. And I answered on 2 levels. The first level with regard to water. Water is so important in our lives. It's everywhere, and even beyond us. It's in space all over, and planets and stars. It's discovered each year. There are new discoveries, and so we need to understand the scientific principles that are involved with water, and those 4 principles, I would assert, are critical principles that are involved, and that people don't realize so much. But beyond that, in all of nature, these are really critically important principles, and let me illustrate with the 4th one that you mentioned, which has caused a lot of misinformation and misinterpretation.
The like charge entities?
No, the 4th one, that like charges, you mentioned, when you have the like same charges. Yeah. So
which is quite surprising.
It's surprising.
Yeah, you learn the inverse.
You learn that you take 2 let's say, negative charges, and they're in the vicinity of each other, and it's natural to assert that they repel,
Yeah.
and their distance will increase. But in water, it's different, and other situations it can be different, and it has led many people astray, many scientists, with the wrong answers, the opposite answers to the real answers. So it turns out, if you remember that early slide that I showed, where the easy is negatively charged and you got positive charges beyond, those positive charges are really important. And so when you stick into water two entities, and let's say they're both negatively charged, what happens is that around each one, EZs build. This is in water now. These are hydrophilic entities. EZs build, and they're negatively charged, and they build on both of those, let's say, particles, if you will. They don't need to be particles; they can be molecules. Doesn't matter. So you think they must be driven apart, but remember, those positive charges get built beyond the negatively charged EZ. And the highest concentration of those positive charges are exactly in between the two particles. So you've got positive charges at the center pulling on those negative charges. And the experiments show, in fact, they come together like this. So the conclusion is opposite what you would reflexively suggest. In an aqueous suspension or solution, they actually come together. They don't draw apart. And this this conclusion is not my conclusion. It was put forth many years ago by the famous, distinguished Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, who is considered to be by many physicists the Einstein of the second half of the 20th century. He's revered among physicists. He was the one, and I believe it was his Nobel lecture that he talked about this. He called it like likes like. That is, like charges, they like each other, and because they like each other, they come together. He said, in his inimitable sense of humor, like likes like because of an intermediate of unlikes. They come together. I'm simply reiterating what he said, and we have published experimental evidence to demonstrate that actually does happen. It's not merely a conjecture; it's a reality. So it's one of those phenomena, that you need to take into account. It's not only with regard to water, but there are other systems in which it might apply. You can't simply reflexively assert that when you have two negatively charged or positively charged entities that they will automatically repel one another. It might happen, but it might not happen. So Anna, just to, I know you got many questions, but let me say in a more general context, these four principles are among a larger set of principles that some of which may not be immediately obvious. But if they're true, then they must be taken into account in any kind of scientific context. And if you don't take them into account, if they're true, you'll get the wrong answer. I think that in many so-called, in many scientific contexts, many ways of looking at nature, you don't always get the right answer. And if you look at the textbooks, there are many assertions about how nature works, which might be wrong. And they might be wrong because they fail to take into account some of these principles that are maybe not so widely known, but clearly supported by experimental evidence and logic. And if you don't take them into account, you're not going to get the right answer. And so my own point of view is that when I read textbooks, I don't automatically presume that what's put forth as ground truth is necessarily ground truth.
Yeah.
If they're simple concepts that have the ring of truth, then yes. If they're complicated, which so many things are, my automatic response is, well, you know, I'm not 100% sure, and I really need to think about this to see whether it's true. Because if you start from a foundation, a scientific foundation that's not valid, everything that grows builds on that foundation is going to be really complicated, and textbooks now are really complicated.
The impact on our life is that water is everywhere, and that we have to understand that we get, as we are mainly water, we get energy from light.
Yeah.
We could be, inside our body, but maybe outside, there is this like charged entities that can attract one another. And I really like this, it's not a metaphor, but if you're thinking about a philosophic approach about liking each other, being attracted with the same charge is possible with the dislike. I really like it. And yeah, but if you can just illustrate maybe the revolution that is on our health or medicine approach, or just one example maybe.
Yeah, sure. Well, one example is, and I guess the central example is our health. Yeah. So, you know, most of us now rely on the pharmaceuticals produced by the pharmaceutical companies, and they, at least in the U.S., they dominate the medical school curriculum. And, you know, many of the people in the medical profession in the US, you have symptoms A, B, and C, and therefore you must take drug D. This is the solution. And, you know, those drugs do take care of some of the symptoms, and inevitably they come with side effects. And
of course,
some of the side effects include minor issues like death, you know, or minor side effect. And this is in the US, this is advertised on television. And I would say something like half of the advertisements that we see are advertisements for drugs. And they're obliged to list all of the major side effects. And many of them do include death as a listed side effect. And, you know, one wonders. Long ago, before pharmaceutical companies came into being, you know, people got sick, and since they got sick, there were measures that were developed over the years, natural measures to deal with that. And there's a progressive and gradual return to some of those measures that were popular in, say, Ayurvedic culture or ancient Chinese culture that seemed to work. And what we found is that many of these expedients are connected with what I've been telling you about fourth phase water. And so what I'm leading to is a kind of general theme that your cells are filled with easy water. In order for your cells to work properly, they need to have a full complement of easy water. They need to be filled with this kind of water. And if they're not, then your cells are not performing up to par, because, as I mentioned earlier, the easy water, that when the cell does what it's designed to do, like a muscle cell contracting, a secretory cell secreting, a nerve cell conducting, when they do it, there's a transition between the easy water to ordinary liquid water and then back again. And this sequence can't operate unless you have a full complement of easy water to begin with. And so if you don't have enough easy water in your cells are not performing. They're dysfunctional, and in some cases even pathological.
So we must do everything to increase this easy water. I saw on one of your presentations that you said grounding to the floor, because we know that it's negatively charged and it helps us to increase easy water. And you talk about Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, also ancient wisdom saying that we have to be grounded. And now with this easy, we understand better scientifically. there is light, but is there another way in order to increase this easy inside of our body?
Well, the most exactly. And if I had answered that question, I would have said exactly what you said. But there are more, and one of them, the obvious one, is to drink a lot of water because the water that you drink, some of it gets peed out, but other of it gets converted to easy water. And so if you don't have the water, the easy will naturally diminish. You'll be dehydrated and also dysfunctional, as everybody knows. So drink water, drink a lot of water is number one. But the second one, which is more subtle, is the so-called juicing, where you squeeze the juice, the water out of plants, out of freshly grown plants in your backyard, for example. So what does that do? Well, what it does is if you squeeze the water from the plants, these huge plant cells filled with easy water because they're new, fresh plants, and then you squeeze the liquid out, and then you drink that liquid, drink that so-called water. It's just basically easy water that you're drinking. It's filled with largely with easy water, and so you're bypassing the conversion of that water from liquid water into easy. You're just drinking it directly, and if you drink it directly, it's going to be helping to fill your cells. So my experience with those health providers, they report that patient comes, it doesn't really matter what their issue is, they're advised to drink this kind of juice from their garden, and they come back a month or two later, and whatever it is that has been impairing their health is reversed, or at least partially reversed, and also they happen to lose weight as a side effect, but which everybody seems to want to do. But it works, and it's simply because it builds easy water. So the bottom line is that besides the grounding or earthing, which imparts negative charge into your body, which we found builds easy water, which is negatively charged, beyond the grounding or earthing, and drink a lot of water, and especially drink easy water from the plants. Yeah, and also one more thing is the light. So you go out in the sun, right, and you're exposing yourself to plenty of infrared energy. As I mentioned, roughly half of the sun's energy is the heat part, is infrared, and where I live in Seattle in the wintertime, it's kind of gloomy, it's gray, we have a lot of clouds, and when the sun breaks through, everybody feels happy. Yeah. And so why is it? Well,
the same in Frankfurt.
Is it really? Oh,
during winter it's hard, but summer is great.
Yeah, well, same thing.
So we are growing our easy phase during summer.
There's one more that your neighbors take into account, but I'm not sure that you do, and that is the sauna, or as the Finns say, the sauna.
Yeah.
I don't know if in Germany you do it, but certainly in Finland and in Russia, the banya or the sauna. So what's going on there? Well, it's heat, right? Whether it's moist heat or dry heat, the heat is essentially the same, not exactly, as I said, essentially the same as infrared energy. So you're exposing your entire body to infrared energy, and the infrared energy, as I mentioned, builds easy water. So if you walk into the sauna dysfunctional in some way, or with pains in your muscles, or a headache, or a depression,
yeah, it helps. Of course.
Yeah, that you come out feeling better. It almost doesn't matter what your issue is, you feel better. So why is it that you feel better? Well, I think you feel better because the infrared energy is building easy water, and whatever organ or organelle is deficient in easy water will be restored to a full complement of easy water, and it becomes functional again.
Thank you for these practical tools to increase our easy water inside our body. My next question is that in your book, you mentioned that easy is storing energy, but also information. And what does it mean that this easy is storing information? What does it mean for us as we are, as I said, I repeat it, mainly water?
Where to start? This is a complicated question, but it's a critically important question. So what does it mean about information? Well, so, I'm receiving information from you, both visually and verbally, but also there's some subtle information, nonverbal information that, we've known for forever, that's being communicated between the two of us, just by some kind of subtle energy that's not well understood. Right. And at first, and by now, let me just say, the bottom line is that there's ample evidence that this information is for real. Okay, because scientists have been studying it now for half a century, and even distinguished scientists like a Nobel laureate, Luc Montagnier, who just passed. When you have results from a Nobel laureate, you tend to pay attention. It doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but you need to start paying attention because this is a man of some wisdom and distinction. But it started with I guess in modern times, with Jacques Benveniste and a Frenchman, that, who that is. Right. Okay. And, he was dealing with cells that would secrete histamine, and he would expose those cells. They're called basophils, but that's just a detail, doesn't matter. He would expose those cells to some antibodies, and when those antibodies were poured over the cells would be triggered in a very specific way to secrete the histamine, to blast it out of the cells. And some guy came, someone who was a homeopath, and said into his laboratory and said, well, I can dilute those antibodies and dilute and dilute and dilute, and then dilute some more, and expose those highly diluted antibodies where there's essentially no antibodies left, only the water that had been exposed to the antibodies, and get the same result. And Jacques, who was my friend,
his research is amazing, but unfortunately, he was such a scandal in the scientific community, which doesn't mean that his research is false, but yeah, I think it was hard to handle and makes you really courageous to work and research about water. When we look at the story of the history of water is such a thing.
Yeah, you're alluding to basically his career was terminated because he was espousing the view that was experimentally supported, that indeed the water has a memory, because the water that was exposed to those agents does the same thing as the original agents. And so, I won't reiterate the story because it's a long story, but his career was terminated by, you might say, an attack from the editor of Nature, who said this is all nonsense, and it got around, and he couldn't get any support after that, and he became a scientific joke to the point where people would say, oh, you're getting gray hair and you're having trouble remembering, just drink some of Benveniste's water because it has memory and that will restore your lost memory. It was a kind of scientific joke, and he failed. So, and one of the reasons for this, lending some support to the other side, the editor of Nature and such, is that when we think of liquid water, at that time, it wasn't known about easy water. You think about liquid water, the molecules of liquid water, at least as we understand are randomly oriented, and they're bouncing around at a furious number of times per second or even per femtosecond. How on earth could such a system store information? It's really hard to understand, yet the experimental results seem to imply that. But now we know there's a different kind of water, fourth phase water. Fourth phase water is like a crystal. The molecules are organized. And when they're organized this way, it resembles very closely a computer memory, which is also a crystal of silicon. And we now have a crystal of hydrogens and oxygens, where the oxygens actually can take on multiple states. Oxygens have a so-called oxidation states. The one we know best is -2, but there's also -1, 0, +1, +2. So you have a situation with easy water that closely resembles the situation with computer memories. You see, and so at least theoretically, the easy water should have the capability of storing information.
I must do this parallel with this epigenetic research showing that emotional aspect can be transferred for 4th generation through the DNA, and it's completely crazy, the idea, but the research showed that, and maybe the easy, knowing that there is this memory, it's one way to explain it.
Yes, I'm completely with you. And easy water surrounds DNA, and so you can imagine how information that is conveyed or stored in easy water could impact the adjacent DNA. Epigenetically, and sure, absolutely. There's a famous.
Knowing that we are mainly water, and this water is 4-phase water, easy, made of energy. My next question for you is: could you make a bridge between the advance in quantum physics and your research? First one, and then can you make a bridge between your research and consciousness?
Yeah, quantum physics is difficult for me because
as a bio,
and well, as the great Feynman says, nobody understands it because it's it's basically abstract mathematics, and if someone claims they understand it, they're either stupid or lying, because nobody can understand it, because there's no intuitive, shall we say, no intuitive relation between what we can understand or intuit and the mathematics. It's mathematics. So I keep my distance from that. I don't claim any understanding of it because there's no real understanding. So I leave that to others, and for me, I guess I have no real comment on it. I know other people talk about entanglement and the fact that one entity can impact another entity, but I'm a kind of person who thinks that nature works simply. There's a principle that starts, I think it was the 14th century, called Occam's razor. It was Sir William of Occam who put forth this principle, and he was a friar. No, he was a churchman, and he was trying to understand about the existence of God, and he said, well, there are two approaches, or two hypotheses. One is that God exists, and the other one is God doesn't exist. And the right answer will be the simplest one. So if you reduce all the evidence for the existence of God and all of the evidence against the existence of God, the simpler of the two hypotheses is likely to be the correct one. And a few centuries later, Isaac Newton thought this was a brilliant idea. Let's apply it to science. So Newton said that nature operates in the, quote, the shortest way possible, simplest way possible. And that principle extended itself for many centuries, and scientists would abide by that principle until the advent of, until 100 years ago, when when the physicists came upon ideas that are based on pure mathematics, and then it became complicated. And so, you know, one needs to wonder whether science has moved in the right direction. And those who are in support of these more abstract approaches say, well, it works very well, and maybe they're right. And others have said, well, Mother Nature doesn't work by abstract mathematics. Mother Nature works by simple principles. And so, you know, so there are these 2 points of view, and the quantum mechanical one predominates, prevails, and most of us, we just leave it to the physicists. They must know what they're talking about, and therefore they're probably correct, because we don't understand. We can't do the mathematics, and we just leave it to them. So this is my comment on that. And the bottom line is, I can't really speak about quantum mechanics because I don't understand it. So why pretend?
Yeah, then a bridge between your research and consciousness.
Well, see, consciousness, which is really translates into the subtle kinds of energies that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And as I said, this kind of energy, it demonstrably occurs, and we've been doing our own experiments in our laboratory to try to see if the application of subtle energies or consciousness or whatever, you know, there are many different terms that describe more or less the same thing, if they impact the physical properties or chemical properties of water. And we've done preliminary experiments, no conclusive results, because we wanted to find out which of the 5 different physical chemical methods we have available to us can detect something. And we think we're onto it, and we're about to perform some experiments, and I hope that we'll have answers soon.
Thank you. That was my last question. Thank you very much for your time, for all this explanation, for your passion in your research, and yeah, for being here today with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akhlem, for your penetrating questions, some of which I've never been asked, and so I appreciate your thoughtfulness. It was a great pleasure.